Hi friends, welcome to the Eastern Front channel. Today we will talk about the memoirs of Friedrich Paulus' adjutant, Wilhelm. He fought with Paulus until he was captured in 1943. Let's try together to understand the reasons for the defeat of Paulus' army in Stalingrad. There were generals in the camp who believed that there would be a draw in this war, because the German army was strong enough to repel an invasion in the West. In this case, the Soviet Union would be left on its own and thus would be obliged to come to some arrangement with Hitler's Germany. It was also possible for an understanding to be reached with the Western powers at the cost of the Soviet Union. Both opinions came from the group of unteachables. Already in August-September 1943, I had not accepted them, but the wish was all too often the father of the thought. The Tehran Conference in December 1943 and developments in 1944 had finally put paid to such thoughts. After some earnest checks, I came to the conclusion that the war was hopelessly lost. Since my talks with Professor Arnold, I was of the opinion that Germany had begun the war without compelling reasons and thus burdened itself with a gigantic guilt. Following my own bitter experience, I had trusted Hitler and his clique when they had begun their crimes against the Sixth Army without thought that they would affect the whole of the German people. I could agree completely with the conclusions which ended the manifest of the National Committee Freies Deutschland. For the people and fatherland, against Hitler and his war, for immediate peace, for the salvation of the German people, for a free, independent Germany. So I joined the National Committee Freies Deutschland, though I had yet to take an active part. I did not do so as I was still not quite ready. I was especially strongly moved by the question of whether prisoners of war should be allowed to deal with the political and military leadership. Would this not increase the chaos? Would it not involve the disintegration of the German front? Would it not endanger the lives of many of their still fighting comrades? My oath of allegiance and the traditional concept of an officer's honor prevented me from taking this step. An important role was played by my relationship with Field Marshal Paulus, whom I honored as a man and whose conduct I esteemed. Could I attack him from behind? I did not feel myself especially personally bound to the signers of the manifest, most of whom I did not know. Despite the deep impression that the personality of Wilhelm had made on me during his visit to Seydlitz, I was now reserved with the communists in the National Committee. These then were some of the thoughts and problems that concerned me during the weeks after the founding of the National Committee. The grounds were basically a similar conflict to that during the battle for the Cauldron on the Volga. Should I follow the voice of reason and actively oppose the apocalyptic developments? Or should I follow Hitler and the oath of allegiance, and in doing so participate in the catastrophe threatening my people? After the inferno of Stalingrad, I must yet turn to all the consequences of Germany's next and greatest misfortune against Hitler and his war. But apart from the understanding about the foregoing question, there was still something needed. A lot of civil courage. I had it, but not enough to be without regard for the attitude of others and my own responsibility to the National Committee Freies Deutschland. Thus my thoughts went here and there. Evening after evening I discussed it with the general standing nearby. I pondered and read, but came to no final decision. It was mid-August and I was taking a walk in the park. There I encountered Rosk. "I have been looking for you, Adam. Do you know already that Seydlitz, Latman, and Korfs are leaving us today?" "Leaving? What has Paulus to say about that, Rosk?" "I have not seen him yet, but you can best ask him that yourself." Paulus already knew about it. "I presume," he said, "it has something to do with the National Committee." Seydlitz's memorandum and his behavior in the Cauldron must be known not only to many of our soldiers and officers, but especially also to the Russians and apparently also to the German emigrants. However, I am convinced that he will remain faithful to us. A tradition among old military families is that in captivity no one ever goes against the head of state. Someone knocked. Colonel Generals Heitz and Strecker entered. Heitz came straight out with, "We must form a circle around the three of them." Especially is this necessary for Seydlitz, as he already in the Cauldron demanded Hitler's orders to be disregarded. Paulus agreed to the proposal. He did not mistrust Seydlitz, but regarded the discussion as irrelevant. The opportunity for one occurred. On the 22nd August, von Seydlitz had his 55th birthday. I had prepared for him a cutout relief of a tower of Seydlitz Monastery. Paulus wanted to present him with this gift on behalf of all the generals, including the Romanians and Italians. Now he decided, at the suggestion of von Heitz and Strecker, to give it to Seydlitz before his departure and to add some meaningful words. Seydlitz was delighted with the gift. He said it was especially well done and assured Paulus that he could leave those remaining to him. This tower, he concluded, will be for me the tower of truth. Generals von Seydlitz, Lattmann, and Darkhorst had already gone. A new discussion arose among us as to where they could be going and what drove them. Would they keep on maintaining a distance between themselves and the National Committee, Freies Deutschland? The same question arose again about 14 days later when Lieutenant General Edler von Daniels left the camp. Meanwhile, 3 new officers had joined us, Colonels Boe, Schildknecht, and Petzold. They came from a camp near Moscow and were bitter enemies of the National Committee. They were of the opinion that should it really be necessary to overturn Hitler, it would be the task of the German people back home and the soldiers at the front. They argued that if we prisoners of war rose up against Hitler, it would be a betrayal. That was naturally water under the bridge for the holding on with Generals Schlegel and Heitz, who still had a strong influence on the thoughts of the whole group of generals. With this assertion, it was easy to call upon such actions from the safe basis of captivity to try to discredit the aims of the National Committee. Paulus too had similar reservations that he expressed in the following manner. Must the impression not arise that such steps come from Russian pressure? Goebbels would not find it difficult to discredit the activities of the National Committee Freies Deutschland as collaboration or a stab in the back. On the 22nd August we had been thinking about Seydlitz. Where would he be spending his birthday? If in the past the relationship between Paulus and Seydlitz had been troubled by individual episodes, the field marshal felt himself closely bound to the general through the old cavalry school. Standing together in this difficult time, the corps spirit showing itself in every situation, that was Paulus's motto. Hampered by one jumping off, making a breach in the general's front, with his inbuilt old officer's corps snobbery, Paulus said, Seydlitz will keep to his word several times to Colonel General Heitz, who, as former president of the Reich's War Court, had seen in Seydlitz a potential traitor since his revolt in the Cauldron. It was a very complicated, boring, and difficult process reaching the new embankment. The expression stab in the back was used by a field marshal. He said it not to demonstrate any personal dislike of the men of the National Committee, but because he was so inclined. The stab in the back legend derived from the peculiar German responsibility for the First World War and from the shame of the November Revolution and the preparations for the War of Revenge, took a central position in the more than decisive political ideological standard equipment of a staff officer of the Weimar Republic. The old generals, from Hindenburg as Reich President and others occupying decisive positions of power in the Reichswehr, were not interested in the truth. They wanted to forget that the First World War had been lost for Germany through military and economic exhaustion, and implied the blame lay in the betrayal of the homeland. I too, during my early studies of history, had, for example, never come across the text of a record of a conference at the Great Headquarters on the 14th August 1918, in which the State Secretary for Foreign Affairs, in the presence of the Kaiser, Hindenburg, Ludendorff, and other leading personalities in the retinue of Wilhelm II, had stated the following: The Chief of the General Staff of the Field Armies has defined the war situation, that we can no longer hope to break the will for war among our enemies through warlike negotiations, and that our war leadership must set the goal of gradually paralyzing the enemy's strategic defensive. The political leadership bows before this declaration by the great generals who have conducted this war, and draws from this the political consequences that politically we will be unable to break the enemy's will to wage war, and that we are therefore obliged to bear the cost of the war situation under the leadership of our politicians. These words indicated quite clearly that a quarter of a year before the November Revolution, Germany was militarily and politically no longer in position to win. To conceal the fact, the stab in the back was officially sanctioned in the Third Reich. It went into the history books and professors' colleges. The November criminals were in essence national betrayers abandoned with the greatest contempt. This whole tangled mess of systematic drummed-in opinions and condemnations had first to be swept aside before a new way could come into sight, Certainly there were the great historical examples of Steen, Arndt, Clausewitz, and Boyen, who appealed to the German people over the heads of treacherous despots and called for a fight for freedom. There was the Convention of Torringen of the 30th December 1812, in which the King of Prussia's General von York, without asking the king, agreed with the Russian General von Diebitsch to cease all hostilities between the Prussian corps and the Russian units. The National Committee's manifest pointed to these historical examples. In fact, it then dealt with the essence of the same problems and similar conflicts now confronting us in 1943. The men of 1812 to 13 renounced their head of state and his followers, and fought on their own responsibility in accordance with their knowledge and historical necessity, and the people's and fatherland's wishes. The group of stubborn ones in Voikovo did not want to let it pass. These men were not prisoners of war, and anyway, they allied themselves with the Tsar and not with the Reds. This last argument was what it was really all about. The eternal conquerors and militarists among the generals did not want to have anything to do with the communists. They hated them on principle on the basis of their own class distinction. They also did not think earnestly about concerning themselves with the communist conceptions of nation, fatherland, state, and war. In the end, all went with the corps spirit and officer's honor that Field Marshal Paulus, strictly within the net of his conservative upbringing, swore by. I, the colonel among generals, was caught in this jungle. Only a millimeter at a time could I extricate myself. One evening during the first days of September 1943, I was sitting reading in my room. Suddenly someone stuck their head through the door and asked me to come quickly. I threw on my uniform jacket as I went along. On the ground near the steps I came across a group of generals. Among them, I could not believe my eyes. Von Seydlitz and Latman. The thought shot through my head that they had returned to Voikovo. But where was Korfs? I could not make him out. Instead, I saw Colonel Seydl and a Luftwaffe major unknown to me, whom Seydl introduced as Major von Frankenberg. Although I greeted both generals and Seydl effusively, I had the feeling that the whole group standing around, among them Colonel General Strecker, were in a state of uncertainty. General von Seydlitz asked me to report his presence to Field Marshal Paulus, which I did immediately. The conversation between Paulus and Seydlitz did not last long. When I was called back by an orderly and entered the room, the field marshal was irritably striding up and down with long steps. "Has there been another clash?" I asked. "No, not that. But in the few days that Seydlitz has been absent, his attitude has completely changed. He is talking about new realizations that he has had in conversation with Stalingraders, but also with recently captured officers, with German immigrants, and with high-ranking Soviet officers. He is talking about the founding of a League of German officers. Bund Deutscher Offizier. I cannot make him out." Finally, Paulus asked that all the generals be summoned so that he could tell them what he had said to me. I agreed to his request. "Go personally round to all the generals." I asked that they meet in the dining room in half an hour. The generals of the former Sixth Army were punctually on the spot. General von Seydlitz sat at his usual place, which went with the seniority of the former commanding general. Paulus asked him to speak. It was as if the dominating gold and red on the generals' uniforms crackled in the assembly, as if at any moment a dangerous explosion would occur. Colonel General Heitz looked around him with an angry face. Colonel Seydl and Major von Frankenberg seemed ready for him to start. General von Seydlitz went over the rapidly worsening war situation for Germany since the battle on the Volga. He referred to the long-expected landing of the Western Allies and concluded that the war was no longer winnable by Germany. I noticed how at this point a murmur went through the assembly and had the feeling that Seydlitz, who was speaking freely, was now coming to the point. One could sense that he was trying to bring his talk quickly to an end. When he called for opposition to Hitler, there was a massive countercry of "unheard of" and "stop," forcing him to break off his speech. Resignedly he sat down again, while uproar broke out around him, in which he was shocked by some personal abuse. Some generals ran to the door and wanted to leave the room. Paulus remained quiet and relaxed through all of this. With some appeasing words, he was able to calm down the noise and enable Major General Latman to speak. He too recalled the German defeat at the front and the air war against the homeland. Then he recalled his own experience on the Volga. Generals and troops had no longer believed overwhelmingly in the highest commander. Hitler had sacrificed them soullessly, coerced them with lies and unrealistic promises in the painful defeat. I knew that Lapman had previously been a convinced adherent of National Socialism. Now in his words was the time for the settling of accounts, the way to self-understanding. He spoke very emotionally. Hitler's brutal power that brought us and our families to the tragedy of Stalingrad will plunge the whole of the German people into a vast Stalingrad if we do not stop him. That is why generals must leave behind their reserve and involve themselves with those who think the same in the fight against Hitler. In contrast to Seydlitz, Lapman was able to end his short speech without a row, although the faces of the generals remained as grim as ever. But when Colonel Seydlitz then initiated the creation of the League of German Officers with the goal of Hitler's downfall, in order to bring about a cessation of hostilities, the orderly withdrawal of the Wehrmacht to the Reich boundaries and renunciation of all conquered territory, there was a real eruption. Any understanding was unthinkable. Colonel General Heitz even threatened to box Seydlitz's ears. He shouted at Major von Frankenberg too. Next to Heitz, Rodenburg, 6 von Arnim, Strecker and Pfeiffer had the most to say. Seydlitz's group was accused of being traitors. Without even casting them another glance, the generals left the room complaining. Paulus was especially pained by this incident. Kitchen staff and orderlies had also heard the noise. Must the camp administration be offered such a display? What was played out in the dining room was more than unworthy, he said, when we returned to his room. Then the door opened and Heitz, Rodenburg, 6 von Arnim, and Strecker entered. One of them said, "We refuse to exchange another word with Seydlitz or his companions. We're not going to be taught by young people like Lapman, Seydlitz, or even this Frankenberg," added Heitz. "We would like to continue the conversation not in your room but out in the park." The generals left the room with Paulus. I remained alone and thought about this lesson on corps spirit and officer's honor. After a quarter of an hour an orderly appeared, Corporal Erwin Schult. "The field marshal asks you to come down." Despite it being evening, the camp was like an agitated swarm of bees. Everything was busy. The generals were moving and gesticulating in small groups up and down the camp road. Paulus was only a few paces from me. "The generals are proposing to conduct an internal discussion on the steps behind the park after breakfast tomorrow morning. All are to attend without exception." A disturbed night followed this announcement. Next morning I was up earlier than usual. All the generals assembled punctually for breakfast. A stormy atmosphere reigned. The meal was quickly consumed. Without exception, all reached the appointed place in the park. After a short, angry discussion, 6 von Arnim put together the following text. 1. We refuse to have further relations with Seydlitz and his companions. No one will talk to them. Those who are accosted will go on without answering. 2. Contact between Paulus and Seydlitz will be maintained by Colonel Adam. 3. The camp administration will be written a letter in which we will protest the sojourn of the Seydlitz group and against further advertising for the German Officers' League, as well as that of the National Committee Freies Deutschland. 4. Lieutenant General 6 von Arnim is tasked with the writing of this letter. 5. The letter will be signed by all the camp's officers. In fact, all the generals signed the petition. I too added my name below theirs. I was then given the unhappy task by Paulus of handing over the petition personally to the camp commandant. I reported to him via the duty officer and was taken straight to him. The Soviet colonel took the paper without a word and I was dismissed. On my way to the camp commandant, it had dawned on me that our declaration was in fact a provocation. From Paulus, too, one could see that the previous proceedings had not been pleasant. I had spoken quietly to Major von Frankenberg for a few minutes immediately after the tumultuous assembly. We also knew that members of the Seydlitz group, including such men as von Lenski, Stolmer, and von Drever, had had short but pertinent discussions. And now this collective condemnation, this attempt at a warning to General von Seydlitz and his companions. "I keep going over, Field Marshal," I said to Paulus, "whether we handled the matter correctly. Seydlitz had assured you and all of us that he had come to us on his own initiative, only following his conscience and his deep concern for Germany. No one had tasked him to do it. But we, the prisoners of war, turned in this provocative way to the Soviet side. You are right, Adam. I too have been thinking it through again. We handled it too hastily. How would a German camp commandant react if a Soviet prisoner of war officer brought him such an aggressive demand? Let us wait and see what happens, said Paulus, tired by the repugnant quarrel. It came to nothing. Apparently, this display of arrogance and obstinacy by the pro-Hitler German generals had been filled with a pitying smile. For the benefit of Paulus and the decent ones among the generals, it must be said that the field marshal was later able to get the regrettable pamphlet back. It remained the only reminder of how the matter would be decided politically. General von Seydlitz and his companions left 2 days later. They were unable to enlist further generals for the League of German Officers. Even the catastrophe on the Volga had not yet enabled these gentlemen to distance themselves from Hitler. They still bowed down before a criminal supreme commander-in-chief and excused the betrayals that enabled further crimes. However, it was wrong to consider this leading group of the League of German Officers as crazy. The unanimity, the corpse spirit, was only skin-deep. Already the hysterical way in which the stubborn ones were proceeding gave rise to new doubts among the sober-thinking generals and myself. Who should I actually hate? Hitler and those who, after the Sixth Army had been hunted to extinction, were now preparing to lead the whole German people to the slaughterhouse, or those who demanded that Hitler must fall so that Germany might live. Dear friends, that's all for today. Please support my channel with any comment. Thanks a lot. It was Tim, and see you.